The coffee was burnt, the eggs were cold, and booth 3 was empty for the first Veterans Day I can remember. Name's Jenny 38 waitress at Lone Oak Diner, where the smell of floor bleach mixes with the scent of cheap syrup every morning. He left behind nothing but a patched-up jacket, 3 coins on the table. And a question I still can't shake. Ever worked with someone for years and realized you never really saw them? Every morning at 7:00 a.m., sharp, the old man in the frayed brown jacket sat alone at booth 3, always facing the window. The diner's door let out a tired squeal as it opened, the kind of sound that seemed too loud in the stillness of early morning. Jenny barely looked up from her notepad. Booth 3 was already taken as usual. She didn't need to check. The man Cliff moved with the same deliberate pace he always had. Not slow exactly, just measured like each step counted. His jacket, worn and patched at the elbow, gave off the faded scent of tobacco and old paper. That morning, like every other morning, he slid into the red vinyl booth seat, set a folded Stars and Stripes newspaper on the table, and glanced once, just once, through the big front window of the Lone Oak Diner. Jenny poured his coffee without a word. She didn't ask what he wanted. She didn't have to. 2 over-hard, dry toast, she mumbled, scribbling on her pad before walking off. As the scent of eggs and burned coffee began to rise, a pair of mechanics in oil-stained jackets eased into the booth near the counter. Dean, the manager, emerged from the back, adjusting a dusty sign that read, "Pie is not optional." He didn't spare Cliff a glance. "Gas is up 20 cents again," one of the regulars muttered, ruffling his newspaper. "Damn shame. Kids today won't know what $5 could get you." Another chuckled. "They don't know what work is either." Cliff didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the dogwood tree beyond the window leaves, the color of old pennies barely clinging to their branches. He held his coffee steady in one hand. His fingers gnarled and spotted like river stones. The other hand lightly touched the edge of the newspaper unopened. Jenny dropped the plate in front of him without ceremony. Eggs, toast, no butter. She turned away, her eyes catching the odd patch on his left sleeve, a faded triangle with barely legible stitching. She tilted her head but didn't bother asking. Just another old military thing, she muttered to herself on the way back to the counter, then under her breath added, "He never tips much anyway." Cliff's jaw shifted just slightly, but he didn't look up. Instead, he unfolded his napkin with the same care a man might show a flag. The chatter around him swirled, a burst of laughter from a booth, the clink of cutlery, the thrum of a Travis Tritt song low on the radio. It was a familiar world, one that had stopped surprising him a long time ago. The toast cooled untouched. He sipped his coffee, stared again through the window. A young boy on a rusted bike zipped past. The air outside was still and gray, thick with the kind of chill that settled into bones. Inside it was warmer, but only just. Dean barked something about clocking in on time to one of the teenage busboys. Jenny rolled her eyes. Back at booth 3, Cliff folded the Stars and Stripes neatly again and slid it back into the crook of his jacket. He looked once at the eggs, then pushed the plate a few inches away. Jenny, drying glasses behind the counter, didn't notice. He pulled out 2 coins from his pocket quarters, bright and clean, and placed them quietly beside the napkin. His movements were as silent as his presence. Then, for the first time in years, he stood before finishing his toast. With a slow breath, he turned toward the door, his boots making no sound on the tile. He didn't look at anyone. No nod. No farewell. Jenny caught the motion in her peripheral vision and looked up, confused. Her eyes flicked to the plate toast, uneaten eggs barely touched. She frowned. "Huh," she muttered. And that's when she noticed. Cliff quietly leave without finishing his toast, something he's never done before. November 11th. The American flag out front fluttered half-tangled as the town forgot what day it was. A weak sun pressed through gray clouds over Camden Ridge, barely warming the glass windows of the Lone Oak Diner. The flagpole at the edge of the parking lot swayed gently in the wind, its rope clinking against the metal pole like a loose heartbeat. The faded stars and stripes struggled to fly straight, tangled halfway on itself. No one seemed to notice. Inside, the diner bustled with its usual mix of half-interested regulars and overworked staff. Jenny moved behind the counter, her hair tied up in a loose ponytail that had started falling since the breakfast rush began. She filled mugs, wiped surfaces, and answered questions with half-nods. Her son Luke sat at the far end of the counter with a half-drawn comic book in front of him and a single crayon in his hand. His sneakers blinked every time he kicked the stool leg, once every few seconds, regular as a metronome. It was a school holiday, and with no sitter, Jenny had brought him in. She hoped he'd stay occupied with pancakes and crayons, but Luke had other plans. "Why's the flag all wrapped up like that?" he asked, squinting through the window. Jenny didn't look. "Wind's messy this morning." Luke twirled his crayon. "Isn't it the day when Grandpa used to put on that funny hat and march in the driveway?" Jenny stopped mid-pour. For a second, the smell of burnt coffee and bacon vanished, and in its place she remembered her grandfather's cane tapping the sidewalk the way he'd stand still at noon every Veterans Day and salute the radio. But the moment passed. She gave a tired smile. Yeah, he used to. And just like that, she moved on, wiping a ring off the counter. A burst of laughter came from the front table where two retired postal workers were exchanging stories, their voices loud enough to drown out the muted television mounted in the corner. It showed a morning news anchor mouthing something under a chyron that read, "Forgotten Veterans, a Growing Crisis." The sound was off. Nobody paid attention. Dean emerged from the back, mumbling curses about food costs and the electric bill. He glanced at the sign taped to the glass door, "Veterans Eat Free Today," and scowled. "Do we even know how many we're feeding for free?" he snapped. Jenny shrugged. 2 so far. Counting Cliff, probably 3. "Well, if he ever pays full price, I'll eat my apron," Dean grunted. "This promo's a joke." At 9:12 a.m., the diner door creaked open. A gust of wind came in with the scent of damp leaves and morning chill. Cliff stood in the doorway. He was later than usual. Everyone noticed, even if they didn't say it. The regulars glanced over briefly. Jenny turned surprised, but not sure why. Cliff nodded slightly and made his way to booth 3, as always. His jacket looked even more worn today, the frayed collar framing his tired face. As he sat, his eyes met Jenny's just for a moment, and something about them made her pause. "Hey, Mr. Luke," called from the counter. Jenny's shoulders tensed. "Luke, what's that patch on your arm mean?" Cliff looked up, slowly. Then surprisingly, he smiled. A thin, brief expression, but unmistakably kind. He touched the triangle on his sleeve. "It's a memory," he said. Luke's brow furrowed, like a photo. Cliff's fingers moved to the inside of his jacket. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, opened it with practiced care, and removed a small, clear sleeve. Inside was a smaller replica patch, same triangle, the thread barely clinging to the fabric. Without a word, he stood, walked over, and handed it to Luke. Luke took it with both hands, wide-eyed. "Whoa." The diner fell quiet for a moment. Jenny stared stunned. Cliff had barely spoken 10 words in all the time she'd worked there. Dean groaned from behind the register. "If we're handing out souvenirs now, maybe we should start charging for those." Jenny shot him a look. "Dean." Cliff said nothing. He returned to his booth, sat down, and picked up his fork. His eggs were getting cold, but he didn't seem to mind. Luke studied the patch like a treasure. "Was he in a war?" he whispered. Jenny didn't answer. She didn't know, but she suddenly felt ashamed. The TV behind her shifted to a clip of an old man being ignored at a city hall ceremony. The headline read, "Cities Struggle to Honor Their Vets." As Cliff finished his plate, he turned toward the window again. The flag still flailed. He reached into his pocket, took out 2 quarters, and placed them neatly beside the receipt. Before heading out, he stopped at the door, turned, and looked out at the flag. Then, with steady posture, he raised his right hand in a salute. Precise. Simple. No performance. Jenny blinked rapidly. Luke stood at the counter and clumsily mimicked the gesture. His hand flopped sideways, but he was beaming. He took the patch and pinned it awkwardly to his backpack with a safety pin from his mom's apron. In a nearby booth, one of the older men leaned closer to his friend. Say, you remember that emblem? I think that's... Before he could finish, a low engine hum rolled through the diner's windows. A black SUV pulled up outside the diner. 3 men in matching Navy jackets stepped out and walked in without a word. No one spoke when the Navy men entered. They didn't look around, just stood side by side facing booth 3. The bell above the diner door gave a faint jingle, then silence poured in like water seeping into every booth and corner. Even the clatter of forks paused as if the cutlery, too, sensed something solemn had arrived. They weren't young, these men. Late 40s, maybe 50s. Faces weathered like worn leather eyes, steady. Each wore a dark navy jacket, zippers dulled with age, insignias barely readable unless you knew what you were looking for. On their chests, faded name patches. Baker Ruiz Thorne. They didn't nod, didn't wave. They simply stood still like sentinels guarding a memory too important to speak of. Booth 3 was occupied as always. Cliff sat there, quiet and unmoved, a half-eaten plate of eggs congealing in front of him. His hands liver-spotted and still rested on either side of a chipped coffee cup. His gaze didn't lift. It didn't have to. Jenny stood frozen behind the counter, one hand mid-reach toward the sugar jar, her breath caught in her throat. That image flashed across her memory 3 weeks ago, pouring rain headlights catching Cliff's thin frame as he limped past her car. She'd offered a ride. He declined with a simple nod. She remembered thinking he looked stubborn. Now she wondered how far he'd walked that night, and how far he'd walked in life. The first Navy man stepped forward. Ruiz. He moved without sound boots, barely whispering across the linoleum. He stopped at the edge of Cliff's table, bent slightly, and extended a hand. Cliff raised his gaze slowly. Their hands met in a brief, firm shake. Ruiz leaned in. Sir. He placed a small pin on the table, then stepped back silent again. The second followed. Baker. His movement was identical, measured humble. He shook Cliff's hand, voice low, reverent. Sir. Another pin joined the first. Thorne came last. He held the handshake a second longer. It was an honor, he whispered. A third pin, gleaming faintly in the muted light, joined the others. They turned together and stood by the window, their backs to the room, eyes distant. No one said a word. Even Dean, who usually groaned at anything outside the menu or budget, stood dumbstruck near the coffee machine, mouth slightly open. Jenny reached for the pot out of habit and moved toward Cliff. She didn't ask if he wanted a refill. She just poured steady and sure, and this time she didn't hurry off. Cliff's eyes met hers. She didn't blink. Across the diner, Luke fumbled in his jacket pocket. The disposable camera Jenny had given him for the school scavenger hunt was still there. He lifted it, hesitated, then pressed the shutter gently. No flash. Just a soft click, the sound swallowed whole by the silence. 3 regulars sitting at the corner booth, Earl, Martha, and James, watched with hands folded. James slowly removed his ball cap and placed it on the table. No one moved to speak. No one wanted to. Cliff looked at the 3 pins for a long time. Then he stood. It wasn't fast, but it was certain. He straightened his coat, adjusted the collar. His voice came low and even. Thanks for remembering. And that was all. The SEALs nodded, nothing more. They turned and walked toward the door, their steps in quiet rhythm. The bell above the door rang softly as they exited, a sound stretched long like an exhale. Cliff followed behind a few paces later. but not before one last glance toward Luke, who clutched the camera like treasure. Outside, the cold light sharpened, cutting across the floor through the glass. No one resumed eating. Even the sausage smell faded beneath something weightier. Jenny turned to Dean and whispered, "We've had a hero sitting here every day, and none of us ever knew." The kids sat cross-legged on the cold wooden floor, eyes wide as the old man in the navy cap cleared his throat. The library smelled faintly of glue sticks and worn pages, its walls taped with crayon drawings of flags and stars. Above them, paper decorations swayed gently from the ceiling vents, red, white, and blue, cutouts strung together with yarn. Near the window, a hand-painted poster read in careful block letters, "Veterans Week." Cliff's cap sat low over his brow, shadowing his eyes. His jacket looked newly brushed, but the creases said it had hung in the same closet corner for decades. As he stepped toward the front of the room, a hush settled. Not the usual wiggling silence of children, but something more reverent, as if they sensed they were about to hear something real. "Mr. Cliff," Mrs. Flanders said gently, standing to the side with a warm smile, "is joining us today because someone in this room wanted to thank him properly." She glanced at Luke, seated in the front row, spine straight as a board, his hands clasped tight around a folded piece of paper. He beamed up at Cliff like he'd invited a superhero. Cliff looked down at the small faces, most no older than 8 or 9. He cleared his throat again. The microphone hadn't been turned on. He'd politely waved it away earlier. "I don't like to talk much," he began, voice rough like gravel that had once been smooth. But Luke asked, "And when someone asks with respect, you show up." The children leaned in. One girl clutched a notepad pencil poised. "I was a corpsman," he continued. "That's a medic. I didn't carry the biggest weapon. I carried gauze morphine and sometimes just my hands." A boy in the second row raised his hand, but Mrs. Flanders gently shook her head. Cliff wasn't telling a tale with bullet points. "There was a time when we were cut off. Me and another guy, Matthews. Good man. Had 3 kids. He took a hit in the shoulder, clean but deep. We were rationed to one canteen." He paused. The room was so still, even the heating vents seemed quiet. I could have saved that water for myself. I almost did. But he was shaking, and I remembered something my mom once said, "If you have enough for one, it's already too much to keep alone." So I gave him the water. Cliff looked up slowly, eyes settling on no one and everyone. He made it home. A few children shifted their expressions, caught between awe and something they hadn't felt before. A little girl whispered, "That's brave." Cliff gave a half smile. The brave ones are the ones who didn't make it back. They don't get to sit in warm libraries or drink cafeteria chocolate milk. They just get remembered, if we let them. Luke stood up then without asking, without cue. He walked up to Cliff and wrapped his arms around his waist, burying his face in the coarse fabric of the jacket. Cliff's hand hovered for a moment, uncertain, then settled on the boy's back with a careful, gentle pat. Jenny stood in the back, arms folded, fingers pressing her elbows as if to keep her composure from slipping through. She blinked quickly, then looked down, pretending to check her phone, though the screen was black. Mrs. Flanders stepped forward, voice softer than usual. "Thank you, Mr. Cliff. That was more than we hoped for." He gave a quiet nod. "You don't need medals to be good," he said at last. "You just need to remember others." The children clapped, not loudly but earnestly, their palms small and open. A boy in the second row wiped his nose on his sleeve. The girl with the notepad had forgotten to write anything. Before leaving, Cliff walked to the paper banner strung near the exit. "Thank you, veterans," it read. Many signatures looped in crayon and marker. Cliff picked up a pen from the table. His hand shook slightly as he wrote his name, just Cliff, in neat, slanted letters. He turned toward the door. Jenny met his gaze from the back, but he didn't stop walking. Outside the library, Mrs. Flanders watched him go. She leaned slightly toward Jenny and murmured, "He never told us his last name." Jenny suddenly feels the urge to find out more. 3 days before Thanksgiving, Camden Ridge woke up to the smell of smoke and the sound of sirens. At 6:11 a.m., the air was thick with the sting of burning pine and charred insulation. A gray haze drifted low above Maple Hollow Drive, swallowing mailboxes and slanting headlights into halos. The fire truck's wail had torn through the sleepy streets like a misplaced war cry. By the time most residents threw on coats and stepped onto frost-bitten porches, the worst was already over. Mrs. Milton's house, a modest one-story with chipped green shutters, was soaked blackened on one side but standing. Its heart, however, had nearly collapsed. "He carried me out," she told the EMT, her voice raspy but steady. "That man, he carried me out before the roof even gave." She gestured weakly toward the edge of the ambulance bench where Cliff sat, soaked in smoke and sweat. His right hand wrapped hastily in gauze, his jacket smelling of scorched cotton and old bravery. The EMT looked down at his clipboard. "And your name, sir?" Cliff shook his head. "Don't worry about me. She needs help." "Sir, you're bleeding. Bandage'll hold." Cliff muttered, eyes fixed on the oxygen mask pressed gently over Mrs. Milton's mouth. She inhaled more than I did. The firefighter captain, a man with a salt and pepper buzz cut and a faded tattoo of the Arkansas Razorbacks on his forearm, narrowed his eyes at Cliff. He knelt beside him, peering closer, recognition dawning. "I know that face," he said. "You were on that old SEAL team, the one with Lieutenant Draper, back in '72. Cliff didn't answer. His left eye twitched, but he gave no acknowledgement. The captain smiled anyway. "I saw your photo once. Training wall at the base. You looked younger then, but hell, don't we all?" Meanwhile, Jenny's pickup screeched to a halt behind the fire truck, Dean jumping out from the passenger side with 2 styrofoam cups and a wool blanket in hand. She spotted Cliff, instantly slouched slightly. Hand-stiff smoke still curling faintly from his sleeves. Her breath caught. "Cliff," she called, voice cracking under the cold air. He didn't flinch, didn't speak. But when she handed him the coffee, he took it with his uninjured hand and held it as if it were something precious. Dean muttered, "We heard it on the scanner. Knew you lived 2 trailers down." Mrs. Milton, now wrapped in a thermal sheet, looked at Jenny and whispered, "He was already outside when the smoke started. Limped straight through my door with a crowbar and wet towel. Just like that." Jenny crouched beside Cliff, trying to catch his eye. "You could have been killed." Cliff shrugged. "She couldn't get to the porch. I could." His voice was flatter than usual, not humble, just tired. Worn. A younger firefighter emerged from the house holding something soaked and half-burned in both hands. He walked toward Mrs. Milton with quiet reverence. "Ma'am," he said, "we found this in your den. Thought you'd want it." It was an American flag, edges crisped, center intact. The stars still shone beneath the soot. Mrs. Milton's eyes brimmed. She looked at Cliff, then back to the firefighter. "Give it to him." Cliff blinked slowly as if unsure what he'd just heard. Jenny reached out gently, laying the wool blanket across his shoulders. "Take it, Cliff." He didn't argue. By noon, the story had begun to spread. First, it was the fire chief's daughter who texted the local radio DJ. Then it was a neighbor who posted on the Camden Ridge Community Board. By 2 o'clock, the Lone Oak Diner radio, the same tinny box mounted above the pie case, crackled to life. The voice of a familiar host, soft and deliberate, filled the booths. "This morning, a quiet veteran saved a life in Camden Ridge and reminded us what service really means." Jenny was wiping counters when she heard it. Dean looked up from the register, eyes wide. "Holy hell," he whispered. "They're talking about him." Luke, sitting at booth 3 after school with a juice box and a sketch pad, jumped up. They're talking about Mr. Cliff. And in that moment, for the first time since Cliff had ever walked through the diner doors, everyone turned to face the window. Because he was sitting there. Still. Same cap, same posture. But now his burned hand rested lightly on the folded flag beside his plate. Jenny decides the diner will do something this Sunday. For him. No matter what Cliff says. Cliff walked into Lone Oak Diner that Sunday morning and froze. The front doorbell chimed like always, soft and metallic, but nothing else was the same. For a moment he thought he'd walked into the wrong building. The familiar scuffed tiles had been mopped to a dull sheen, and the scent of burnt bacon was replaced with fresh brewed coffee and a faint trace of lemon polish. But it wasn't the smell or shine that stopped him cold. It was the silence. Dozens of faces turned. No one smiled. No one called out. They simply stood, mugs in hand, eyes steady, reverent. Like the kind of silence Cliff had only known beside graves marked with white marble and a single flag. It wasn't empty silence. It was full thick with recognition too long withheld. Outside, through the fogged window, a handmade canvas banner swayed in the light breeze. We remember. Booth 3, his booth was draped with the American flag Mrs. Milton had pressed into his arms. In the center of the table stood a small bronze plaque, polished and gleaming. In honor of Clifford Ray McNeil, SEAL Team 2. Next to it, encased in a wooden frame, was his faded patch, the one Luke had carried like treasure, now mounted beside a line scrawled in Jenny's hand. Kindness doesn't ask for a receipt. He didn't move. For the first time in years, his posture slouched slightly as if bearing weight that had just been shifted outside of him from private burden to shared story. Jenny stood by the booth, apron pressed and clean, holding a fresh cup of coffee like it was a medal. She said nothing at first, just extended it toward him with both hands. "It's on the house," she finally whispered. Dean was beside her, not chewing gum, not fiddling with receipts, just still. He handed Cliff a white envelope sealed with a paper clip. "Donations," he muttered. "From folks round town. Thought maybe heating bills." Cliff blinked. His fingers, calloused and still bandaged from the fire, reached for the cup first. Then the envelope. "I don't know what to say," he said, voice low and raw. "You already did," Jenny replied. He stared at the booth, then back at her. "Would it be all right if I—" His glance flicked toward the table. Jenny nodded, stepping aside. He sat carefully, setting the coffee down without a sound. After a long moment, he looked up. "2 plates of breakfast if it's not too much." "One to go." Jenny raised an eyebrow. "To go." "For Mrs. Milton," he said. "She said she missed dry toast." Jenny smiled, turning away quickly so he wouldn't see her eyes gloss. The order rang up quietly. Dean, surprisingly gentle, dropped the extra plate in a paper sack and left it by the door with a handwritten note for a neighbor. No charge. Cliff ate slower than usual. The food was no different. But the room had changed. No phones rang. No silverware clattered. The townspeople, dressed in Sunday best and flannel alike, sipped coffee and let the quiet hang between them. Not because they were unsure what to say, but because they knew words weren't needed. At 9:37, a young man in a fresh recruit's jacket stepped through the door. Hair high and tight nerves written across his face. He scanned the room, then approached the counter. "Excuse me," he asked Jenny, nodding toward booth 3. "Is booth 3 taken?" Jenny's lips curled into a warm smile, her hands wiping dry a ceramic mug. "It's reserved," she said softly. "But you can sit with him." He never asked for recognition, and yet when it came, it was quiet, like the man himself. In a town that once overlooked him, Cliff reminded everyone that true service often happens in silence, and real heroes never need to be seen to be felt. Kindness, after all, doesn't wear medals. It lingers in gestures, memories, and patched-up booths. Like a porch light left on for someone coming home, one simple act of grace can illuminate an entire town. If this story found its way to your heart, perhaps there's someone near you who's quietly waiting to be noticed too.